safe and sound at home again. Let the water roar, Jack, safe and sound at home again. Let the water roar, Jack, long we've rocked on the roaring main, now we're safe ashore, Jack. Don't forget to roll, shipmate, ollie, 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 aye, aye, oh.
Born in humble surroundings on the banks of the River Wear in Sunderland, Jack Crawford would be raised to the status of a national hero. He'd give the English language a new statement of loyalty, be rewarded by his king and applauded by the nation. Yet once his moment had passed, his life spiraled into poverty and oblivion. He was ultimately laid to rest in an anonymous grave in his hometown, just yards from where he grew up. This is his story, Jack Crawford, the hero of Camperdown. Born in the East End of Sunderland, Crawford's beginnings are unremarkable. The place of his birth is now consumed by the port and little remains of the close-knit houses that made up the Pottery Bank area of the town. It was here on the 22nd of March 1775 that Jack Crawford was born. Brought up in sight of the river, it wasn't long before he joined his father as a keelman, transporting the region's coal down the river to the waiting transports to be sent south.
I think it would have been a natural progression for a lad like Jack Crawford. As far as I understand, he was the kind of person who would lived on the seaside, watched out over the ships coming in and out, and it was going to be a natural thing. He was always going to work somewhere on the water, on the river or on the sea.
The Northeast keelmen are legendary, known for the dominant control they exercised over their respective domains. The keelmen of the River Tyne further north regularly fought against their employers in order to protect their trade, occasionally striking and even coming to blows with the authorities. After serving his apprenticeship with his father on the keels, Jack was finally ready to move on, and in 1786, at the age of just 11, he joined the Peggy, working out of South Shields on the River Tyne to further hone his nautical skills. As an experienced and time-served seaman, Jack Crawford was now a valuable asset, and one that the nation had need for.
The press gang is a funny thing because everyone thinks that the press gang could just take people off the streets. They couldn't. You could only be pressed if you had been to sea. So the question is, how did the press gang know you'd once been at sea? The answer is, by your walk. Sailors all walk bow-legged. By the clothes, if you wore trousers, bell-bottom trousers, you've been to sea. If you've got a tattoo, you've probably been to sea. In other words, they're easy as anything to spot. So that's why people who'd been to sea and didn't want to be pressed would go undercover.
Many sailors, and particularly the region's keelmen, carried out what were classed as an essential duty for the region, and as such they had official protection from the press gangs. Although again, in reality, many protected persons found themselves at sea in the Royal Navy with little recourse. Another method of recruitment was to offer an incentive to join up in the form of a cash bounty and better pay than pressed men. Whether pressed or joining as a volunteer, Jack Crawford finally entered the Royal Navy in 1796. As an experienced sailor, the world that Crawford entered would not have been that much of a culture shock. He would have been used to the cramped conditions, living his life regulated by sailing duties and sharing his cramped space with many others. In fact, the life of a sailor in the Royal Navy has to be looked at in contrast with those on land. In the Navy, you were pretty much guaranteed to be fed 3 square meals a day. They were literally square, served up on wooden pallets. You were paid, and should your ship capture one of the enemy, you were entitled to a share of the ship's worth in prize money, a bounty paid to the crews of victorious warships by the government. The share of a common sailor was far smaller than that of the captain and his officers, but could still far outshine anything you might earn on land.
The thing about life before the mast is that everybody thinks it was, after Churchill said, life in the Navy is nasty, brutish and short, and in some respects it was. But on the other hand, you probably got fed a lot better than you would on land. You got fed a huge amount of food and almost permanently drunk from the grog. I should think it was a tough place if you weren't hard and self-confident and physically fit. But if you weren't, you either survived and got hard and fit, or you didn't survive. It's a tough world, but on the other hand, those people are probably a lot physically fitter and healthier than we are.
Don't forget your old shipmate. Folly, olly, 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 I-I-O.
The political landscape of the time was turbulent and Europe was once again at war. The French Revolution of 1789 had unsettled the established order and its effects had been felt around the world. Cries of liberty and equality were not confined to the French shores. As the revolution evolved, it became something far more sinister, as any person thought to be an enemy of the new republic met with Madame Guillotine, including their king Louis XVI and his wife, the irrepressible Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. Neighbouring nations saw the French uncertainty as an opportunity to flex their muscles, leaving the new republic with little choice but to defend itself militarily. What started out as a defence of France eventually evolved into invasion, and the tricolour spread across Europe. Great Britain and her wavering allies struggled to constrain the French disease on land, the only victories being provided by the Royal Navy. Firstly under Admiral Howe at the glorious 1st of June in 1794, followed by the Battle of Cape St Vincent in February 1797, where a certain Commodore Nelson proved his worth to the nation. (1797) was a critical year for Great Britain and the Royal Navy, and one that proved a tipping point in the nation's fortunes. After the high of the victory off Cape St Vincent, politics took a nosedive when there was a general mutiny in the Navy. After years of neglect by the establishment, the sailors, despite repeated attempts to settle their justified grievances amicably, took extreme measures. The sailors refused to sail from the fleet anchorage at Spithead off Portsmouth. As the Spithead mutiny was reaching its conclusion and the government were backing down, the mutiny spread.
The most important thing to recognise about 1797 is that there is one mutiny and one strike. What goes on at Spithead in the early months of the year is a strike. It's a perfectly legitimate request for certain things to be addressed. We would like fresh fruit and vegetables when we're in port. That seems perfectly reasonable. We would like some part of our pay to be remitted to our wives when we're at sea. Well, that seems perfectly reasonable. And there are 100 officers, and here's a list of them, and we think they're stupid, tyrannical, cowardly idiots, and we want you to get rid of them. Well, that's a bit more of a problem, because it's officers and men. The whole thing was grotesquely mishandled by the Admiralty, who sent the wrong person to deal with it, and then when the right person was sent to deal with it, it was all done too late, it was all done too bureaucratically. And in the end, the men said, right, we're not going to sea. Even then, they said, well, we're not going to sea, but if the French come out, we'll go out and beat them, and then we'll come back and we'll go on strike again. So that's what happens at Spithead on the south coast. The mutiny at the Nore in May, much more serious affair. This was sedition, very obviously so, fermented by a chap called Richard Parker on one of the ships at the Nore. And yeah, he was a seditious character, and they were threatening to kill officers, all the sorts of things that weren't going on at Spithead. And of course it took an extremely firm hand to put them down and sort them out.
As the summer of mutiny was unfolding, the French sought to take advantage. Under the direction of the United Irishman Wolfe Tone, the Dutch fleet, now part of the Batavian Republic and under the control of France, was ordered to sea to attempt an invasion of Ireland and from there England. The North Sea Fleet that was tasked with watching the Dutch coast was commanded by the towering figure of Admiral Adam Duncan. And it was in his flagship, the Venerable, that Jack Crawford became a national hero. The mutiny at the mouth of the Thames had spread to the North Sea Fleet, and Admiral Duncan had used his strength of character and personality to quell the disquiet. This solved the problem aboard his flagship, but rumblings continued within the fleet until the mutinies finally finished with the hanging of Richard Parker and his co-conspirators at the Nore in June. Contrary winds had prevented the Dutch from putting to sea, and in mid-August the invasion was cancelled and the troops disembarked. The mutiny window of opportunity had been lost, and the Royal Navy now had its prime asset, its men, back under control. This makes what happened in October hard to understand. The Dutch Admiral Jan Wilhelm de Winter received orders from his French masters to put to sea and to engage the British. The troops had been disembarked, the invasion had been cancelled, and Wolfe Tone had moved on to Paris. Quite why the order to engage was given remains a mystery. Perhaps a naval victory by a French or French allied force was considered a morale-boosting necessity by the French Directory, and the North Sea was seen as its best chance to gain one. As events would prove, if this was the case, they were sadly mistaken. On the 7th of October 1797, Admiral de Winter received his orders to put to sea and to seek out and engage the British. By the 9th, Admiral Duncan, who was restocking and refitting at Great Yarmouth, received word that the enemy were at sea and set out with his fleet towards the Dutch coast to hunt them down. The scene was set for one of the greatest and fiercest naval battles in the great age of sail.
In a way, it's quite a simple battle. Everyone talks about Nelson's genius, about the Battle of Trafalgar, where Nelson splits the line in two places. Well, people have done it before. Specifically, that's what Duncan does at Camperdown. He splits his ships into two very loose formations. One of them takes the first third of the Dutch fleet, one of them takes the rear third. The idea, you split the fleet up, you create a general melee, and the fleet with the finest gunnery will win. It's like a pub brawl, very carefully organised pub brawl.
On the morning of the 11th of October, Duncan split his force of 14 ships of the line, 2 fifth-rates and 2 frigates, in two. Admiral Onslow commanding the southern group and Duncan the northern. They eventually came upon the Dutch in a single line of battle formation just a few miles off the coast. The Dutch ships were better suited to the shallow waters off the coast, and de Winter attempted to use this to his advantage by luring the British squadron closer into shore in the hopes that they would become trapped and aground. Duncan knew these shores well and correctly surmised what the Dutch were about. Time was of the essence, as every moment that passed moved the enemy closer to the shore. Duncan gave the order to cut the Dutch line and to position their ships between the Dutch and the coast, preventing the enemy from moving into the shallow water, cutting off any escape. It was Admiral Onslow's division that was first into action. Commanding 8 ships, he set about the rear of de Winter's line, soon overwhelming them. Captain Bligh, formerly of the Bounty, commanding the Director, saw that their battle was won and turned his ship north to support Duncan, whose flagship, the Venerable, was receiving a pounding from de Winter's ship, Vryheid. It was during the battle between the Venerable and the Vryheid that Duncan's flag was shot away from the mainmast. A plain blue flag designed to make the flagship recognisable to the fleet. Its removal could be interpreted as a sign of surrender. What actually happened next is open to much speculation and interpretation. The story has certainly become embellished over the years, as it's been told and retold. Jack Crawford himself used to dine out on the story, and we can surmise that his part would not have been played down. As cannon and musket balls, along with numerous other types of projectile, rained down upon the flagship, Crawford placed himself in an extremely vulnerable position. Was this an act of heroic determination that Jack took upon himself? Was he ordered to do it? One colourful account, written shortly after the battle, places Crawford firmly amongst the ranks of the hero. During the heat of the action, the flag halyards were shot away when John Crawford, a young, active fellow, seeing the ship's colours drop down, coolly tucked them under his arm. He skimmed aloft, up the shrouds like a dart, while the musket balls and grape rattled around him in showers. Yet fortune seemed to stand his friend, for in despite of all opposition and rattling of shot, up went bold Jack Crawford, with the hammer between his teeth and a few spike nails in his pocket. The lieutenant, seeing what Jack Crawford was about, called out, "Grape and canister to the 5 aft guns. Point them well at the enemy's poop. Watch the ship roll and be ready, my men." "Aye, aye, sir," responded the men. By this time, Jack had got to the mainmast. He immediately shoved one of the nails through the head of the flag just below the toggle and drove it into the mast above the cross trees. He then descended about half a dozen rat lines and drove another nail, and thus he proceeded until he descended to the main cap, where he took a bold turn with the tack and hammered all fast. "Huzzah!" cried the brave fellow as he threw out the fly of the ensign, which in an instant floated triumphantly into the air. 3 hearty cheers resounded from the deck of the Venerable as Jack triumphantly exclaimed, "There! It won't come down again without carrying the mast with it." This account is so filled with morale-boosting, boys'-own fanciful nonsense as to almost make a mockery of Crawford's undoubted bravery. What it does begin to show us is just how deeply the nation and its fanciful storytellers took the legend of Jack Crawford to their hearts.
He was a celebrity, without a doubt. Anyone who does what he does and becomes a hero is a local celebrity. And I think it's the celebrity he lived on for the rest of his life. It's my understanding that the local pubs, Jack was the centre of attention, but he was a kind man. He was the kind of person who would tell his stories and also buy people beer from his pension. And I think many people probably used him for that because they knew he was kind, they knew he was the local celebrity, and celebrities do have hangers-on. And I'm sure Jack had that for the rest of his life.
The battle, fought off the small Dutch village of Camperdown, was an outstanding success for the British. Of the 2 evenly matched fleets, Duncan had captured 7 Dutch ships of the line, 4 fifth-rates, 4 frigates and numerous smaller vessels for no loss. After a spring of mutiny, the Royal Navy had once again proved its worth, and a simple sailor had become its hero. Politically, it couldn't have been better for those at the Admiralty.
I think strategically it's the most brilliant victory of the Napoleonic Wars, bar none. Nelson's a very clever man, Collingwood brilliant, they're all brilliant in their own way, but Duncan's brilliance is to use what he has at his disposal to make the action happen on his terms and to defeat a technically superior fleet. He gets his squadron to take on this plan, execute it perfectly, and completely destroys the Dutch Navy as a fighting force.
After the battle, when Admiral de Winter came on board Duncan's flagship, he offered up his sword in surrender, as was the tradition. Duncan approached him with his arm outstretched as an act of friendship and said, "I would rather take a brave man's hand than his sword." So what of Jack Crawford post-Camperdown? Shortly afterwards, he attended a service of thanksgiving at St Paul's Cathedral in London, a ceremony attended by a rather miserable Horatio Nelson, still recuperating after the loss of his right arm during a failed attempt to attack Santa Cruz on the island of Tenerife. Crawford was presented to King George and awarded a pension of £30. He was presented with a silver medal from the people of Sunderland, and for a while he became the poster boy for the common sailor, helping to assuage the year of mutiny and placed the Royal Navy back in the population's heart.
Safe and sound at home again, let the water roar, Jack. Safe and sound at home again, let the water roar, Jack.
Crawford was eventually discharged from the Navy, and it's rumoured that he attended Nelson's funeral in 1806. Returning to Sunderland, he got married and attempted to settle down. However, domestic bliss was to elude him. It's said that he was often seen wearing his Camperdown medal, accepting free drinks from the town's populace, recounting his tale until thrown out of whichever hostelry he was in to make his way home. He eventually pawned the medal to help pay his way and appears to have become something of a pitiable figure on the streets of Sunderland. One colourful story has it that in a state of intoxication he was once seen riding a pig through the streets.
He gave it away, had nothing. And I think, like many people at the time, the natural progression was the workhouse and paupers, paupers' graves, and that's how he ended up. The family would not have had the money to give him a decent burial.
Jack Crawford, the hero, fell from grace. His life was eventually cut short when cholera came to Wearside. On the 10th of November 1831, Jack Crawford died, part of an epidemic that would sweep the region and see his mortal remains thrown into a pauper's grave, forgotten. Forgotten Forgotten, that is, until high Victorian hero worship rescued him from anonymity. Interest in his story resurged 50 years after his death, and an appeal was set up to provide him with a fitting gravestone. By 1888, this had been accomplished with so much money left over that a monument was unveiled to him in Mowbray Park 2 years later. The city dignitaries applauded their lost son, reclaimed his medal, which had found its way to descendants of Admiral Duncan, and with pomp and ceremony placed the simple sailor of Pottery Bank back atop the mainmast to nail his colours for eternity.